The night began like any other on the space station, but for the human assigned to the predator cub's containment area, it carried a weight that could not be ignored. The predators were not ordinary animals. They were the young of a species feared across the galaxy for their strength, intelligence, and untamed instincts. Even as cubs, they were large, restless, and unpredictable. Many guards who worked on the station avoided this duty, whispering about close calls and stories of sudden attacks that had happened in the past. When the assignment came, no one volunteered. The roster shifted uncomfortably until it landed on the human caretaker. Instead of refusing, the human quietly accepted, even though the challenge was great. Walking through the cold, metallic halls of the station, the human carried only a data pad and a steady resolve. Every footstep echoed against the walls, reminding them of the isolation ahead. The predator cubs were held in a reinforced chamber, surrounded by steel barriers and dim light. As the human entered, the sound of low growls vibrated through the air. Dozens of glowing eyes turned toward the doorway, sharp and unblinking, watching every move. A wave of tension swept over the caretaker, but they stood tall, refusing to show hesitation. It wasn't courage born of arrogance, but rather of quiet determination. Someone had to do the job, and tonight it was them. While others hid from the task, the human understood that respect could only be earned through presence. They stepped further into the containment area, adjusting their breathing, steady and controlled. The night had just begun, and the cubs were waiting. The human knew this was not just about survival. It was about proving that calm strength could meet even the sharpest of eyes in the dark. The artificial night cycle dimmed the lights of the station, casting long shadows across the containment area. The air inside grew heavy, filled with the low hum of machines and the faint rasp of claws against metal floors. At first everything seemed calm, but then the cubs began to stir. Their bodies shifted in the darkness, tails flicking, paws moving restlessly as if they sensed something unseen. One by one, they rose from their corners, pacing slowly within the enclosure, their glowing eyes flashing each time they crossed beneath the dim lights. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged, like the stillness before a storm. The human caretaker stood near the observation platform, posture straight, heart beating faster than they wanted to admit. They had been warned about the cubs' moods, about how quickly rest could turn into rage. Tonight, it seemed the stories were proving true. Growls began to roll through the room, deep and rumbling, carrying a weight far larger than the young creatures that produced them. Each sound made the space feel smaller, as if the walls themselves leaned in closer. The human did not move hastily. Instead, they adjusted their breathing, keeping each inhale and exhale slow and steady. Their eyes followed the cubs carefully, noting which ones were leading the restless march and which lingered in the shadows. The signs were clear. The cubs were not settling, and danger was creeping closer with every moment. Yet in the middle of the rising tension, the human remained still. They knew any sudden reaction might spark the violence that hovered in the air. Tonight would be a test of presence, and the uneasy silence was only the beginning. The realization came slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor. The human stood alone in the dimly lit chamber, watching the cubs prowl with growing intensity. They glanced toward the door, half expecting to see another guard step in, someone who might share the burden of the night. But the corridor beyond remained empty, silent, and distant. No backup would arrive. No one else wanted this duty, and everyone had made it clear earlier. When it came to predator cubs, no guard dared to interfere. The human was the only line between calm and chaos. The thought pressed down like a heavy weight, but retreat was not an option. Leaving now would not only mean failure, it would invite disaster. The cubs were restless, their claws scraping the floor, their eyes fixed with sharp curiosity and hunger. If the human walked away, the fragile barrier of control would collapse, and there would be no one to stop what followed. Still, beneath the pressure, there was no fear-driven panic. Instead, a quiet determination settled in. The human adjusted their stance, grounding themselves with steady breaths. Every sound, every movement from the cubs was measured against their own calm presence. They knew that true authority wasn't about size, power, or weapons. It was about resolve. Tonight, that resolve would be tested in ways few could imagine. Alone in the chamber, with only the glowing eyes of predators surrounding them, the human accepted the weight of responsibility fully. If no one else would step forward, then it would be their duty to stand unshaken. The chamber felt larger in the silence, as if the walls had stretched farther away and left the human exposed in the middle of an endless stage. Dozens of glowing eyes broke the darkness, fixed on the lone figure who dared to stand among them. The cubs did not rush forward, nor did they retreat. Instead, they watched, their sharp gazes tracking every subtle shift of posture, every turn of the human's head, every movement that might reveal weakness or strength. The human took each step with care, deliberate and measured, refusing to stumble or rush. The sound of boots on metal echoed softly, swallowed almost instantly by the heavy stillness of the room. The cubs paced in slow arcs, their claws scraping faintly against the floor, the sound like whispers in the dark. Each growl that rose from their throats carried no full attack, only the promise that one wrong move could trigger it. The humans' breaths came steady, controlled. They understood this was not a moment for panic or haste. Authority had to be shown in silence, not with noise or aggression. In that stillness, a strange balance formed. Predator and caretaker locked in a silent standoff, the air charged with tension. Every glowing eye in the chamber told the human one thing: they were being judged. Their strength was not in weapons or guards at their side, but in their ability to stand calm under the weight of fear itself. And in that moment, the silence was more dangerous than sound. From the circle of glowing eyes, one cub moved first. Its paws pressed softly against the floor, each step slow, yet filled with a tension that made the air grow heavier. A low growl slipped from its throat, not the sound of an attack, but of curiosity mixed with warning. The others froze in place, their gazes locked on both the cub and the human, waiting to see what would unfold. The human did not flinch. They stood rooted to the spot, spine straight, breathing steady, refusing to show even the smallest sign of fear. Every instinct urged them to move back, to raise their hands defensively, but they resisted. This was not a fight to win with force. It was a test of patience, of calmness, of authority that did not rely on aggression. The cub crept closer, its eyes narrowing as it studied the motionless figure. At times it paused, sniffing the air, ears flicking at every faint sound. The human's steady presence seemed to unsettle it more than violence would have. There was no sudden reaction, no loud noise, no threat, only quiet strength. At last, the cub stood just a few feet away, growl softening into something uncertain. The human remained still, allowing silence to speak for them. It was not dominance by force, but by restraint. And in that fragile moment, the first thread of understanding stretched between predator and caretaker, fragile yet unbroken. The room held its breath, as if the smallest movement might decide whether the night turned to chaos or to something entirely different. The moment the first cub drew close without attacking, the rest of the pack stirred. Their low growls blended into a chorus that seemed to vibrate through the metal walls of the station. One by one, they began to move, their padded steps deliberate, circling wider until they formed a living ring around the human's resting place. The faint scrape of claws against the floor echoed like whispers of danger, each sound reminding the human of just how sharp those claws could be if things went wrong. The human's heartbeat thundered in their chest, but outwardly they refused to show it. Shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, face calm, every detail of their posture was controlled. Fear, they knew, would only feed the cub's instincts, and panic might ignite the spark of an attack. Instead, they let silence guide the moment, meeting the cub's glowing eyes with an unblinking, quiet resolve. The circle tightened gradually, the cubs pressing closer, their tails lashing and ears twitching. Some lowered themselves closer to the floor, ready to spring if provoked, while others merely tested boundaries with slow steps and rumbling throats. The human adjusted slightly, just enough to show awareness, but not enough to signal weakness. The night felt endless, heavy with suspense, as predator and caretaker stared across the shrinking space between them. Yet in the stillness, the human's calmness began to create a strange rhythm, one that even the cubs seemed hesitant to break. It was a battle without words, a fragile contest of patience and will, and the outcome balanced on the edge of a single breath. The silence grew heavier, broken only by the soft breaths of the cubs and the steady thump of the human's heart. Every glowing eye remained fixed on the lone figure in the center, waiting for a sign, waiting for weakness. Then, in that charged moment, the human lifted a hand, not quickly, not with threat, but slowly and with intention. The gesture was small, almost delicate, but it carried weight. The cubs froze at once, their low growls fading into silence, as if they too understood the meaning behind the movement. The hand hovered in the air, steady and calm, before lowering gently toward the ground. No words were spoken, yet the act itself sent a message. There would be no flight, no fear, no surrender, but also no reckless challenge. It was a balance between strength and restraint, a display of quiet authority that seemed to ripple through the ring of predators. A few cubs shifted uneasily, their claws scraping the floor again, but none dared to advance. Their instincts urged them forward to test the fragile human before them, yet something in the stillness of that simple motion made them hesitate. It was not weakness they sensed, it was control. The human's eyes remained steady, unblinking, making sure the gesture did not lose its meaning. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the entire room holding its breath. For the first time, the cubs' tension wavered, and respect, subtle but undeniable, began to rise from the edges of their doubt. What had begun as a test of fear was slowly transforming into recognition of authority. The night was far from over, but the balance had shifted ever so slightly in the human's favor. The circle of cubs tightened, their glowing eyes filled with restless energy, when suddenly one of them broke the fragile calm. With a burst of speed, the young predator lunged forward, claws flashing under the dim light, its growl sharp and fierce. For a moment, the air felt like it would shatter under the weight of danger, but the human did not panic. Instead, instinct and control worked together, and in a single precise motion, the human shifted to the side, redirecting the cub's force with calm strength. There was no strike, no violence, only a firm movement that sent the cub sliding harmlessly past. The cub stumbled but quickly regained its stance, turning back with wide, puzzled eyes. It had expected fear, perhaps retreat, but what it found was something different. Calm authority wrapped in restraint. The human stood tall, breathing steady, showing no hint of aggression yet no weakness either. This was not the reaction of prey, nor was it the reckless challenge of another predator. It was a display of control, as if the human had chosen not to harm even when given the chance. The other cubs, who had been tense and ready to follow, froze in place. Their eyes darted between the lunging cub and the steady figure who had stopped it without harm. Something unspoken passed between them. A realization that what they were facing was not ordinary. Their growls softened into quiet murmurs, their bodies swaying with uncertainty. The silence that followed felt heavier than the lunge itself, for it carried with it the weight of recognition. In that single test, the human had proven both strength and mercy, and the cubs, watching closely, began to understand the lesson unfolding before their eyes. The room grew quieter after the sudden clash, the air heavy but no longer carrying the sharp edge of danger. The cubs, who only moments before had seemed ready to tear apart anything in their path, now stood still, their glowing eyes fixed on the human with a new kind of attention. What they had witnessed was not weakness, but neither was it mindless dominance. The human had shown strength without cruelty, control without fear, and that balance stirred something inside the young predators that they had never felt before. Their growls softened into low rumbles that carried more curiosity than threat, as if they were beginning to wonder who or what this being truly was. One by one, their stances shifted. The rigid tension in their bodies eased, claws that had been scratching against the cold floor now rested more calmly. They continued to watch, but the sharp hunger in their eyes dimmed, replaced by something far more complex, an awareness that perhaps the figure standing before them was not an enemy, but a force to be reckoned with. The cub that had lunged earlier lowered its head slightly, confused yet unwilling to challenge again, while the others exchanged glances that mirrored their shared hesitation. The human, still steady and unmoving, allowed the silence to stretch, understanding that it was not the time for sudden gestures or commands. Patience spoke louder than words, And the cubs, sensing that calm confidence, began to see strength in a form they had never recognized before. Respect was not demanded, it was earned, and in those tense moments, the first fragile thread of respect began to take root in their wild hearts. For the first time, the line between predator and protector seemed less clear. The stillness of the room slowly shifted into something less threatening, as if the air itself had softened. The cubs, who had once paced in restless circles with sharp growls and twitching claws, began to move differently now. Their steps were slower, their gazes more measured, and the weight of hostility that had hung so heavy was fading into the background. The human did not move with suddenness or fear, but remained rooted in calm strength, every breath steady and every gesture deliberate. That unshaken presence became something the cubs could not ignore, like a quiet fire that drew them closer without force. They circled again, but this time the pattern carried a different meaning. No longer was it the motion of predators sizing up prey, but rather young creatures testing boundaries with curiosity instead of hunger. Their glowing eyes held not just sharpness, but a glimmer of understanding that this being before them was unlike any they had ever known. The human did not bare teeth or raise weapons, yet there was no weakness in that still figure. Instead, there was an invisible strength, something beyond physical power, a kind of authority that spoke to their instincts in ways words never could. The silence grew heavy but not unbearable, filled instead with a subtle rhythm of trust slowly forming. The cubs edged closer, not in challenge but in acknowledgement, their movements more cautious than aggressive. The human, sensing the change, allowed the moment to unfold naturally, without pressing it forward. And in that fragile balance, an unseen bond was woven, a silent agreement between species who had once stood on opposite sides of fear. For the first time that night, hostility gave way to acceptance, and the cubs began to see the human not as prey or intruder, but as a presence worthy of space among them. The human stood steady, every muscle controlled, every breath measured, knowing that in this silent test, even the smallest mistake could change everything. The cubs no longer circled with raw aggression, but they did not rest either. Instead, they moved with restless curiosity, their glowing eyes fixed on the lone figure in their midst. Each cub carried its own rhythm. Some stepped forward boldly, others lingered at the edges, twitching their tails unsure of what to make of the stranger who refused to bend or break. The human's eyes followed each motion, studying the way their shoulders shifted, the way their ears flicked back and forth, the way their growls softened into questioning murmurs. Every gesture the human made was chosen with care. A slight tilt of the head here, a calm lowering of the hands there, signals meant not to provoke, but to show awareness without surrender. The cubs seemed to notice. Their movements slowed, their sharp claws no longer scraped so loudly against the floor, and their tests became subtler. One would edge close, pawing at the ground as if daring the human to flinch, while another would brush by in a wide arc, watching for a reaction. Yet the human did not falter. Calmness remained like a shield, quiet but unbreakable. It became clear that the cubs were not mindless beasts, but intelligent, sensitive beings. They pressed at boundaries, pushing to see where the line was drawn, but they stopped just short of true defiance. And with each moment that passed without fear or retreat, the unspoken rules between them grew stronger. The human was no longer simply a caretaker in the eyes of the cubs, but a figure who moved with intent, one who understood the language of silence, patience, and respect. The night was far from over, but a strange balance was being born in the dark. The hours stretched long, filled with a silence that felt heavy and alive, broken only by the quiet breaths of predator cubs and the faint hum of the station's systems. The human remained exactly where they were, calm and unshaken, resisting every natural urge to shift nervously or retreat. Fear had no place here, for the cubs were watching every detail, testing not with open violence, but with patience of their own. A twitch, a glance, a sudden movement, any sign of weakness could tip the balance. Yet the humans stayed still, their presence steady as stone, their heartbeat fast but controlled. The cubs, once restless and sharp with instinct, began to slow. Their growls softened into low rumbles, curious but no longer hostile. They paced in shorter paths, their eyes still fixed on the figure in their midst, but with less edge in their movements. It was as if they were waiting for the human to break first, to falter under the weight of tension. But the opposite happened. By not yielding, by showing strength without aggression, the human turned the waiting into proof. Authority, the cubs seemed to realize, was not always about claws, teeth, or dominance through fear. It could also be about control, about patience that outlasted defiance. The longer the night stretched, the clearer it became to the cubs that this being would not be moved, that the quiet figure before them held a strength different from their own. Respect was not demanded. It was earned, slowly, invisibly, like a bond forming in silence. And as the cubs lowered themselves into the shadows, resting without threat, the human knew a silent victory had been won through nothing more than patience. By midnight, the atmosphere inside the containment area had changed completely. What had begun as a tense standoff, full of growls, sharp movements, and piercing eyes, now shifted into something unexpected. The cubs, who only hours earlier had circled like predators preparing for a strike, began to slow their steps. One by one, they lowered themselves closer to the ground, their tails brushing the floor in a quieter rhythm. Their eyes, once burning with challenge, softened with curiosity and an unusual calm. The human remained steady, sitting upright yet relaxed, every gesture slow and deliberate, as if to remind the cubs there was no threat, no fear, only presence. Then, in a moment that surprised even the human, the first cub edged forward and settled just within reach. Not attacking, not challenging, but simply resting. Another followed, then another, until the space around the human's resting spot was filled with the quiet shapes of predator cubs lying close, their sharp breaths steady but calm. Their aggression had faded into a reluctant trust, an unspoken acknowledgement that this human had passed a test few could endure. From behind the reinforced glass, the guards who had refused to step forward earlier watched with wide eyes. What they were witnessing felt unreal. No training, no weapon, no force had been used, and yet the cubs, creatures bred for strength and dominance, had accepted the human as one of their own for the night. Whispers spread among the watching staff, disbelief mixing with awe. The human had not only survived, but had gained the respect of the pack, something none of them had ever thought possible. When the station's artificial lights flickered back to life, marking the arrival of a new day, the mood inside the containment chamber was no longer heavy with tension. The cubs, once restless and aggressive, stayed close to the human, but without the sharp growls or hostile pacing that had defined the long night. Their eyes, which had glowed with suspicion in the dark, now reflected something different, a quiet acknowledgement. The human, who had spent the entire night without breaking composure, had shown them something they could not ignore. Strength that did not need claws, authority that did not demand violence. The cubs no longer circled or tested boundaries. Instead, they moved with a cautious calm, occasionally glancing at the human as if to confirm his presence was steady and unshaken. Even the smallest gestures, a shift in posture, a deliberate breath, were met with subtle responses of acceptance. What had begun as a trial of survival had turned into the birth of respect. Outside the chamber, guards and staff who had avoided entering stood in stunned silence. They had expected chaos, perhaps even tragedy, but instead they saw harmony where none should have existed. Authority had been established in the purest form, not by fear, but by patience and resilience. As the artificial dawn filled the space, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. One human alone had earned the respect of predators simply by refusing to yield. The events of that night did not remain locked within the walls of the containment chamber. Word spread quickly across the station, whispered first among the guards who had watched from a distance, and then carried further by staff and workers who could hardly believe what they were hearing. The tale was simple, yet powerful. One human had spent the night surrounded by predator cubs, creatures feared by even trained soldiers, and had walked away not with scratches or scars, but with their respect. No weapons had been raised, no force had been used, and no threats had been spoken. Instead, patience, Calm presence and quiet authority had turned danger into trust. For many who heard the story, it became more than just an account of survival. It was a reminder of what courage truly looked like, not loud or reckless, but steady and unshakable. People spoke of the human's bravery with admiration, calling it an act that proved strength could exist without violence. Even those who had never entered the cub's chamber felt inspired, realizing that true authority was not about fear, but about resilience and understanding. Over time, the story grew into a legend repeated in the station's halls, told at mess tables, and remembered by new arrivals. It became a source of pride, showing that humanity's greatest power lay not in force, but in the ability to stand firm, calm, and unafraid, even when surrounded by predators. That night was remembered not just as survival, but as a defining moment, a legendary night where one human's calm heart silenced the growls of beasts.